We're going to unravel the layers of faith woven throughout history. "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" is the pin that we see on lots of people around St. Pat's Day. My wife's mother was a Callahan, the oldest of 13 Irish, and so I love the Irish. But it's amazing to see the story of one famous person that is associated with Ireland, St. Patrick. We're going to talk about this amazing person and how he still is being remembered today as having an impact on your life. Stay tuned.
Here's the question of the day, which will be answered at the end of today's program. Though Darwin and Lincoln were born on the same date, February 12, 1809, how different were their legacies?
St. Patrick, why do we remember him even though he died around 461 AD? It's an amazing person who changed the lives of millions. Well, Patrick lived at a time when the Roman Empire, which had existed for over 1,000 years, fell. In 476 AD is the official date at when the Visigoths finally conquered the city of Rome. And then the Vandals and then the Ostrogoths and these different tribes overran it. And then Europe went into the Dark Ages. Well, in Britain, which was a Roman colony, they had to pull the Roman troops back, and so it began to be invaded by different other Viking-type tribes. And Patrick was kidnapped at 16 years old. And this is what one historian, Mary Cagney, wrote in an article, Patrick the Saint, in Christian history. She writes, "With no Roman army to protect them, the Roman legions had long been since deserted from Britain to protect Rome from barbaric invasion." Patrick, and the word Patrick is Latin for nobleman. And so we must assume that Patrick's family was pretty well-to-do in Roman society. It says, Patrick and his town were unprepared for attack. The Irish warriors, wearing helmets and armed with spears, descended on the pebble beach. They were braying their war horns and struck terror into Patrick's heart, and he started to run toward the town. They estimate about 50 of these ships, and the Viking-type ships had a low keel, so they could go like a canoe up rivers that were fairly shallow. So the big ocean-going ships had to stay out in the harbor, but these Viking-type peoples could go up the rivers to where these cities were, jump out, rob, rape, kill, and steal, and then jump back into their boats and go back down into the ocean. And so about 50 of these boats came to this area. The warriors quickly demolished the village, and Patrick darted from amongst the burning buildings, the screaming women. He was caught, and the barbarians dragged him aboard and bound for the east coast of Ireland. Well, Ireland at the time was ruled by the Druids. The Druids were a bloodthirsty order of people. That's where we get Halloween from. The Druids believed that the woods were filled with spirits, demons that needed to be appeased. And so that's where we get the jack-o'-lantern from, where they would put out this ugly face on a pumpkin to try to scare away the demons. Unfortunately, that's not the way that you can scare a demon away. The Word of God is the only way that you can. But the different Druids would try to appease these spirits in the woods, and they would give sacrifices, and unfortunately, human sacrifice. And they've actually uncovered some of the bogs, these tar pits, where they would have people bound up and they would shove them in there and have them die, thinking that somehow that would appease these spirits. Aren't you thankful for Christ, who was our sacrifice and paid for our sins, so we don't have to be appeasing spirits? Nevertheless, the Druids were an order that did laws. They had oral laws that they would sing, sort of like bards, like traveling minstrels, but only they were the law and the priests sort of at the same time for their pagan religion. They'd travel from village to village throughout Ireland, and they would sing their laws and also kill people. But here is what Thomas Cahill wrote in his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And I quote him in my book, St. Patrick. He writes, "The Druids sacrificed prisoners of war to the war gods and sacrificed newborns to the harvest god. Believing that the human head was the seat of the soul, the Druids displayed the heads of their enemies proudly on their temples and their palisades, their wooden forts with the wooden log walls, and they would stick somebody's head on top of the poles there." It says, the Druids even hung skulls from their belts as ornaments and used them as footballs in victory celebrations. So I guess they'd cut off somebody's head and sort of kick it around a field. They were fond of using skull tops for ceremonial drinking bowls. And they also had shrunken heads and decapitated heads. And it's just gory. I apologize for having to read this to you, but I wanted you to get a picture of what this country was like when this 16-year-old Christian boy was kidnapped at a time when this 1,000-year-old Roman Empire had crumbled, and here he was surrounded by paganism to the core. It was not like America where they had Christian history way back in there. It had been pagan from time immemorial, and here is Patrick there. Well, the Druids believed that these woods were filled full of these spirits, and that's where we get the trick-or-treat from, and that's where we get the leprechaun from. So the leprechaun, this spirit that lives in the woods, was more or less the demon. And so it's sort of ironic when they picture sometimes in artwork St. Patrick as a leprechaun doing a little Irish jig, when, if anything, he would have chased them out. But we see that Patrick lived here. Now, when he was over there for 6 years in Ireland, he was a slave to a Druid chieftain named Milchu, and he had to be a shepherd for this chieftain. And Patrick wrote in his confession, he says, "But after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep, and many times a day I prayed. The love of God and his fear came over me more and more, and my faith was strengthened, and my spirit was moved so that in a single day, I would say as many as 100 prayers, and also as many as at night, even when I was staying in the woods and on the mountains. And I used to get up and pray before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain. I felt no harm, and there was no sloth in me, as I now see, because the spirit within me was fervent." So here is Patrick tending the sheep, getting up in the middle of the night, snow and frost, and praying. Now, this is from his confession. Now, all historians agree that there are two writings that are genuinely written by Patrick. One is his confession, and the other is the letter to Coroticus. Coroticus was a British general warrior that was capturing Irish that Patrick had converted to Christianity, and he was taking them from Ireland to Britain as slaves. And so Patrick lamblasts him, and he's basically the first abolitionist. He's speaking out against slavery. And he says to this Coroticus, he says, "Here you are taking the bride of Christ and making it a prostitute to harlots, as a harlot and so forth." So this is the letter to Coroticus, very powerful anti-slavery document that was written there in the 4th, 5th century. Well, the Confession of Patrick is an interesting work. Later in life, after Patrick had started 300 churches and baptized 120,000 people, there were church politics back in Britain. And when Patrick was a young boy, and he even acknowledges in his confession that when he was a young boy, he was not a Christian, even though his father was a deacon and his mother had taught him to pray, but he had confided to a friend that he didn't believe in God. And so this friend, after Patrick becomes this popular person, begins to tell people about it. And so the politics in the church, which is unfortunately still there today. They say, well, Patrick, we want you to leave Ireland, come back to Britain, and we're going to have a little investigation. Patrick refuses to go. He said, God called me to evangelize Ireland. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to write my life story, my confession, and send it over as his testament of his faith. So we sort of see this situation. Had not they accused Patrick, he never would have written his confession in his defense, and we wouldn't have known it. Similar to the Apostle Paul. Had he never been put in prison, he never would have written all of those epistles, those letters that he wrote while he was in prison. So sometimes God uses what the devil meant for evil, and he turns it around for good. That it was bad that Joseph was betrayed and sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt, but it turned into good because he was able to provide for his Hebrew family years later when there was a famine. So anyway, here we are. Patrick, in his confessions, is writing about his conversion. And he says, and then at last the Lord opened the sense of my unbelief, that I might at last remember my sins and be converted with all my heart to the Lord my God, who had regard for my abjection and mercy on my youth and ignorance, and watched over me before I knew him, and before I was able to distinguish between good and evil, and guarded me and comforted me as a father would a son. So here's Patrick. He is in the island of Ireland, and he begins to pray, and then he has a dream. This was where it gets interesting. He writes this, and then one night I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, it is well that you fast. Soon you will go to your own country. And again, after a short while, I heard the voice say, see, your ship is ready. But it was not near, but at a perhaps 200-mile distance. So I left the man that I had been with for 6 years and went with the strength of God who directed me to the ship. Well, he gets to the ship, and on the coast there are some rough and tough sailor-type people taking wolfhounds and putting them onto the ship with the intention of taking them to Europe and selling them as hunting dogs. And so Patrick is allowed after a little, they turned him away at first, but finally he prayed and they changed their mind and they let him come. And they said, if these dogs will mind you, you can come along. And they're amazed because the dogs obeyed Patrick and became very peaceful around him. And then Patrick talks about how when they got to Europe, they had been caught in a storm and blown way off course, and they landed in southern Gaul, which today is France. And they get off, and lo and behold, it was an area that was just wiped out by the Visigoths or the Vandals, one of those tribes. And so he says that they went for 28 days without food. And so Patrick has this captain of this group turn to him and say, tell me, Christian, you say that your God is great and all-powerful, then why do you not pray for us, seeing that we are suffering from hunger? And Patrick said to them in full confidence, be truly converted with all your heart and to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible with him. And Patrick prays, and then he says that shortly thereafter a herd of pigs crosses the road, and they capture the pigs and eat them and stay there for several days. And then Patrick notices that they don't want to let him go, that they begin to treat him as a slave. And so he says he went from one enslavement to another. But then Patrick has the Lord speak to him again in prayer. And he says, and once again, after many years, I fell into captivity. And on the first night I stayed with them, I heard a divine message saying to me, 2 months you will be with them. And so it came to pass on the 60th day, the Lord delivered me out of their hands. So Patrick was finally delivered and then went to the different church leaders. And there's lots of different stories about how he maybe studied to become a minister there off the coast of France at an island called St. Honorat, and maybe worked at a monastery at St. Martin's Monastery. And so this is what he wrote in his confessions. He says, and again, after a few years, I was in Britain with my people, who received me as their son and sincerely besought me now at last, having suffered so many hardships, I should not leave them to go elsewhere. So Patrick went back to Britain and lived a pretty uneventful life until he was around 40 years old. Then he had another dream. And in this other dream, he gets called back to Ireland. And I'm just going to read a portion of this. He says, "In the depth of the night, I saw a man named Victoricus coming as if from Ireland with innumerable letters. And he gave one of these to me. And I read the heading, which ran, 'The Cry of the Irish.' And while I was reading, I thought I heard at that moment the voice of those who were beside the wood of Folkleth on the western sea, crying out, 'Please, holy boy, come and walk among us again.' Their cry pierced to my very heart. I could sleep no more, so I awoke." Stay tuned as we see what Patrick did after this dream. St. Patrick, the amazing story of his life from tragedy to triumph, is a book that I wrote to bring out the history of this person that we're still remembering over 1,500 years after he died. Imagine what you would have to do for there to be a day to celebrate you 1,500 years in the future. Well, that's what Patrick did. And when he was 40 years old, he was back in Britain and he had a dream. And the dream was calling him back to Ireland. You won't want to miss this story of what happened next. Well, Patrick decided to become a minister, and he studied and submitted himself to the church leadership. And we can see how he studied there with a Germanus, who was a bishop there in Auxerre, France, and then there was Pope Celestine I. Now, the church decided that he just wasn't prepared enough, so they sent somebody else as a missionary to Ireland named Palladius. Unfortunately, Palladius died within a year. Now, why do I bring that up? Is sometimes you have a call from the Lord, and you are all excited, and you prepare yourself, and you're about ready to do it, and it seems like somebody else got to do it instead of you. And there's this temptation to maybe get upset. Well, don't. Stay in faith, and in God's time, he'll make it happen. So in the year around 432 AD is when Patrick was sent as a missionary to Ireland. And he has about 12 different guys that go with him, and they're unarmed, and they sail across, and he was there for the next 30 years of his life. And he says, "I dwell among the Gentiles in the midst of pagan barbarians, worshipers of idols and other unclean things." Anyway, Patrick decides to get off the boat and go to visit that chieftain where he had been a slave. And when you read the story is, he gets to where that chieftain's home was, and it was burnt to the ground. Evidently, there was a war with a neighboring tribe, and they came in and killed his former owner and destroyed the farm. So had Patrick not obeyed the Lord and escaped, he would have been on that farm, and he probably would have been killed too. So that's a good encouragement that when the Lord speaks to your heart to obey there. But and we use the word to confirm that it's the Lord speaking. Well, Patrick decides to go to the chieftain in that area. And amazing style of evangelism that Patrick used, that he would go right into the den of that chieftain and would confront them with the gospel. And so this is what R.J. Unstead wrote in People in History, which I quote in my book on Patrick. He says, "Some of the wild Irish threw stones at Patrick and tried to drive them away. Patrick made peace with them, and then they led them to the hall of the greatest chieftain in those parts. The chief was feasting with his warriors and druids. And when the messenger rushed in to say that strangers had arrived, the long smoky hall became quiet. And in walks a little band of these preachers. One of them was carrying a tall cross. The chief stared curiously at them. And of course, the druids wanted to immediately kill them. when they realized that they were preaching a new religion, because the Druids, who were their pagan religion, were the counselors to the king, and if the king liked this other religion better, the Druids would lose their position of influence. And so the Druids wanted to kill him, but the king's like, wait a second, we don't get visitors that often here, and this guy has courage to walk in here totally unarmed. And then, interestingly enough, Patrick speaks to them in their own language. So here, how did he learn their language? Well, he had been a slave for 6 years. So sometimes when you go through struggles in your life and you feel like, why am I going through this? You might be learning a lesson or learning a language that the Lord can use to use you later to minister to those people in a way that others could not. Well, Patrick, in R.J. Unstead's book, it says, lifting his hand, Patrick begins to speak to them in their own language, which he has learned as a slave. And he said, we are men of God. We have come to bring you good news, the news of Jesus, the Son of God. And he goes on to speak. Well, the king, the chieftain, there were about 60 to 100 different chieftains along Northern Ireland. So they didn't have big cities like, London or Paris or whatever. It was just these sort of semi-nomadic tribes. They'd stay here for a while and stay there, but then they'd fight each other. Well, this chieftain was so impressed with Patrick that he gave him a plot of land and let him build his first building, his first church. And later that chieftain converted and got baptized. And so Patrick began his work. Well, again, the Druids didn't take this sitting down. And so many times they tried to kill him. Matter of fact, it's listed at least a dozen different times that Patrick was facing death. And says the Druids were angry and alarmed at this new religion. And so the chief became Patrick's friend and was baptized, and he gave them some land. Well, one of the other books that I used in my research was the Encyclopedia Britannica. And it writes this regarding Patrick and what's called the challenge at Tara. So Patrick's style of evangelism was pretty bold. He'd go to the top guy, the top dog, and present the gospel to him, knowing that if he converted, then there'd be a larger chance that those underneath of him would convert. And so Encyclopedia Britannica says royal authority, Patrick was challenging the royal authority by lighting the Paschal fire on the Hill of Slain the night before Easter's Eve. And it chanced to be the occasion of a pagan festival in Tara. And so this pagan king every year would make everybody extinguish their fires. And then they would have to bring some gift, a cow or a virgin or something, to these Druids, and they would get some coals to relight their fire for the next year. Well, this night happened to be the night before Easter. And Patrick was like, darn me if I'm not going to go ahead and I'm not going to submit to this king. So Patrick gets his courage up, and he goes to the top of the highest mountain, and he builds a bonfire. And in my book, I have a picture where you can see the plain, and you can see this hill that sort of juts out. Well, Patrick went to the top of that hill and built a bonfire. And one of the 6th century historians, Marucci, wrote this. He said that challenging the Druids at Tara, the custom was whoever lit a fire before the king on that night would be put to death. Patrick lit the Paschal fire before the king on the Hill of Slain. The people saw Patrick's fire throughout the plain, and the king ordered 27 chariots to go up and seize Patrick. Seeing the impious heathen were about to attack him, Patrick stood up and said, "May God come and scatter his enemies." You won't want to miss what happened next.
Now, here's the answer to today's question. Though Darwin and Lincoln were born on the same date, February 12, 1809, how different were their legacies? Darwin's theory of evolution has been used to try to deny the existence of God and promote atheism. Atheistic evolution inadvertently contributed to the slavery and death of millions. In fact, more people have been killed by atheistic communistic regimes that have died in all religious wars combined. Lincoln, on the other hand, declared days of fasting to God during the Civil War and instituted an annual day of thanksgiving to Almighty God, a traditional every president has continued. In his Gettysburg Address, Lincoln stated, quote, "This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom," unquote.
So Patrick is on the top of a hill. It's called Croag Patrick. Matter of fact, the Irish put a statue of Patrick on top of the hill. And today there are thousands of Irish that make pilgrimages to the top of that hill every year. And so here's Patrick on top of this hill. And the historian says that when he prayed, may God come and scatter his enemies, that it says, by this disaster caused by Patrick's prayer in the king's presence, 7 times 7 men fell, and the king, driven by fear, came on bent knee before the holy man. So Patrick was not one to say, well, these Druids don't have any power. No, he said they got power, but the power of God is greater. Similar to Moses when he went to Egypt and put the staff down on the ground and it turned into a serpent. And what did Pharaoh do? Pharaoh had his magicians come and put their staves on the ground, and they turned into serpents too. But Moses' serpent ate up the pagan serpents. And so that was Patrick's ideas. Yes, there's demonic power, but the power of God is superior. Well, anyway, this was Patrick's style. And there was another story. It says that in a display of magic, a Druid had invoked demons and brought about a dark fog over the land. Patrick said to the Druid, cause the fog to leave, to disperse. The Druid was unable to. And then Patrick prayed, and with his blessing, suddenly the fog cleared and the sun shone. And so the prayers of Patrick, then it goes on to say, and the Druid was consumed. And the king was all upset because his Druid had died. And Patrick said, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and this will happen to you if you don't. And so the chieftain said to him, it is better to convert than to die. And so the chieftain converted. Anyway, interesting stories that are passed down through history regarding Patrick. You will be fascinated by this book, St. Patrick, the real story of his amazing life from tragedy to triumph.
This has been a TCT Network exclusive production. If you would like to see more exclusive special programs, send your support to TCT, P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959.